So Tasso, thanks for taking the afternoon to talk to me. I know there's a really exciting thing that we want to talk about, which is the playbook. But before we get to the playbook, there's a couple of questions that anybody who works or knows me says, you work with Tasso, ask him this. And so I feel the need to ask you a couple of these questions because I know there are other people watching and tuning in right now that would like to know. You know, you started a company that was fully distributed. In fact, it's now the largest distributed company in the world. What was the moment, like what was that aha moment when you're like, hang on, this isn't just an idea or a new way to work, it's actually a business?
Well, it was when I was having a better experience working with people. I was at a company full of supposedly the best engineers in the world. We had the chief architect of PayPal, the co-founders of PayPal. The company ended up selling to Google solely because of its engineering prowess, which I was a fortunate individual to be part of that engineering team. And then I left and I started working with engineers remotely in Argentina, Russia, and I actually was having a better experience than the supposed best experience that life could possibly offer in terms of engineering. And so that's when I really understood that working remotely is much more beneficial from the talent perspective, the recruitment perspective, and really just the working dynamic perspective.
Now, one of the things that is, going on right now with the global pandemic, there's sort of two camps. There's one that says, hey, we're all going to go back to the way it was. There's a lot of people working remotely. In fact, right now, right upstairs, my wife, who works in Azure at Microsoft, has been working remotely for 5 weeks, and they've never believed that they could work remote. I mean, nothing could happen unless we were at the office. What do you think's happening in the world of remote work? Will we all just, the people that worked at offices, are they going to go back, or is everyone together learning something that's really powerful and going to change the way we engage talent?
Absolutely. I think it goes well beyond just how we engage talent. It's how we work with our current coworkers, especially for those who aren't used to working with those coworkers remotely. And so this has really provided Fortune 500s, lots of different types of small and medium-sized businesses that thought they could never, ever work in a remote environment, the opportunity to do so. And really more so, and I'm simply borrowing Bill Gates' words, the permission to do so. Boards that are meeting now quarterly are doing so remotely where they were never able to do that. And this is going to change fundamentally the landscape of business forever. I mean, I do not believe that airline ticket sales, especially in the business class level, will actually ever return to the previous COVID era sales rates that they were, primarily because people have recognized that we actually don't need to have this face-to-face interaction to facilitate serious business. And so while that's what we've been championing and been striving for a decade or so, you're now just seeing the whole world come attuned to it almost automatically. And it's kind of an amazing thing to experience.
I've heard the business class comment a couple of times with people that do sort of high level consulting. And there's like, hey, there's no way that my client's going to pay $11,000 for me to fly from the United States to London when they can get me on a Zoom call, and that becomes the new normal. You have a lot of enterprise clients and a lot of small business clients that the company deals with. What are you hearing from those clients as it relates to more distributed or working with on-demand freelancers?
Well, they're more attuned to it now than they ever have been. And sure, there's an economic component to it where they're not hiring as aggressively right this moment, but we are getting feedback that they've recognized the fact that they can work remotely more fluidly than they even realized, even our great clients. And so being able to work with them in the future seems more promising than ever. I can say that. And that's something that we're seeing across the board with Fortune 500s, SMB clients, and really everything in between.
Now, I want to get to this playbook that the team has been working on. Your entire SLT has been working extremely hard to put down onto paper the best practices. And when I got to see it, I have to be honest, I've read tons of them. Every major consulting firm has released one, and it says a lot of words. I felt like I was reading the inside look of how, and the magic sauce of how Toptal was built. I mean, down to the pictures of the inside tools that are used, and very specific guidance, even around, how to write in Slack, which is something that I learned working with Toptal. Yeah. But it's impressive, the level of detail and advice. I felt that if I was a founder and I read this book, and I could start a fully distributed company from that. So I know it's being launched tomorrow. I want to ask you a couple of parts of this that maybe you could react to. The first one was around people, right? And the head of HR had a really interesting quote at the front of it that said, look, remote can be harder, but it makes us more resilient. It makes us better. And this idea that because things are hard, they're necessarily bad, or we shouldn't do them. Tell me how you think, over the past 10 plus years of building this company, think about talent. Because when I read the book, it was very different in very specific ways and very strategic ways from any other company I've been a part of.
Well, I would say the difficulty may lie in adjusting to a remote work environment primarily, and maybe secondarily organizing that when you're not familiar with how to do that outside of an in-office environment. And so those are the two key areas where I've seen people proclaim that there's difficulty. Now, for me, it's kind of been natural. So it's hard for me to speak from the first person experience about that, because I've been doing this for 10 years or so very successfully. So when I hear comments like that, I can only speak to them from the third person, in effect. And so with that said, the elements that make remote working difficult for some people, or I should really say building an organization difficult for some people, especially in the context of people, really comes down to, how do I make sure that reporting structures are kept intact, and that those reporting structures are galvanized within a remote work environment where people actually know and understand that they're being held accountable by somebody else in a chat room, right? Whereas it's not you looking over somebody's shoulder or having a quote unquote serious conversation. It's somebody texting you saying you either need to do a better job, or somebody might be holding you accountable, and you have to understand the ramifications of that. Sometimes that doesn't come through. Sometimes people just don't react to it. And you wonder as a manager, well, what do I do, right? If I can't sit down with them in person in a meeting and say, hey, we need to have a serious conversation about your performance. And so, especially from a people or HR perspective, people sort of get taken aback and say, well, how do we coach this low performer to be better? How do we create an org chart that people understand viscerally and know that there's real accountability tied to all this? And so there's an element of making it real for the people who are part of the organization that doesn't come naturally to a lot of folks. And so at Toptal, we have a lot of training that happens to be able to get people up to speed with how we operate specifically. We've built tools at Toptal to be able to help people, let's say, acclimate from an in-office environment to a remote work environment. And so that gives you some flavor as to how we do it at Toptal.
One of the things that I've always heard is that, if you don't have a location, if you're not doing the happy hours, there's not a ping pong table, there's not a kombucha tap, and all of the things that bring culture, to a company, which is the physical interaction, that remote is just, it's not possible to bring culture to a remote organization. And one of the things that I hear constantly about the company, and I felt in having worked with the company, is there's a very strong sense of values and culture. And I think that comes from you. I think that comes from your senior leadership team. If there's people that are watching that are struggling with that, like, what does culture mean when I can't have physical interaction? What advice would you give them? What are some of the things that you learned maybe the hard way as you were trying to build not only the team, not only bringing great engineers from around the world, but really instill a culture that could help you scale, that was beyond sort of what you could, control, with a small amount of people as it scaled out?
Well, let me take one step back and talk about distributed teams as they existed maybe 20 years ago. You had hacking groups on IRC. And for those of you who don't know what IRC is, let's just say a more geek version of AOL chat rooms, right? little bit more sophisticated than AOL users. But in any event, let's leave it at that. And so those hacking groups or cracking groups or whatever they were, they had very, very tight knit. They were very, very tight knit, period. And so what made them tight knit? They all valued the same thing. They were all after the same mission. They sort of all had the underlying values or lack thereof in some instances. And so the point being is that they were all united by the same elements. And if you look at Edgar Schein's pyramid of cultural values, there's at the top the surface elements. What are you wearing? What is your environment? All the different elements that characterize us from a first look, first impression perspective. Then there are stated values that you state that you believe in, right? And you can almost think of those as what a religion believes in, what a political party believes in, or on the contrary, what a corporate culture believes in, right? These are the values, the real true values that the organization believes in, that you want others to believe in, and that you want to have aligned with the rest of your team. Then at the very bottom of the pyramid are underlying assumptions, things that you just assume predicated off those stated values and so on and so forth. Now, in a remote working environment, especially when it comes to a company, it's much more dynamic, much more diverse, much more all-encompassing than a niche hacking group or a cracking group or something like this that existed, where you're doing one specific thing, everyone's on the same page, and you're just doing something very narrow and specific. You have HR, you have design, you have business leaders, you have stakeholders, you have external partners. There's just so many different elements where you're never going to have everyone who's on this very narrow mission with these very, very narrow set of values. And so you have to state those, and you have to formulate those intelligently and get everybody aligned with what that means from a professional perspective. And so that can be challenging, right? It can be challenging because not everybody believes in the same thing. Not everyone is on the same page to be even able to formulate those values in the first place, right? So companies that haven't gone through this exercise, it's very difficult because the analogy is this, right? If you walk into a room and there's 50 people there and there's no music at all, and this is a really good example to highlight culture, right? And you start blasting rap music, half the people are going to say, "Oh, this is amazing."
Right.
Half the people are going to leave. And so if there's no music, you sort of have a choice. Is it going to be rock? Is it going to be rap? Is it going to be classical? So you're able to make that decision. But by making that decision, you're going to ostracize a subset of your people and then embolden another subset. And so, especially in a remote culture where it's not clear what type of music is playing because you don't have the Palo Alto office where everybody's in flip-flops and there's sort of just some underlying assumption that we all might like some kind of music or might be on the same page, or to the contrary, be in that big skyscraper on 57th Street in New York City and all be wearing Patek Philippe watches, right? And have some underlying assumptions that, well, okay, we sort of all know we're on the same page. There's none of that. And so to state that up front and to do that when the whole team hasn't even met each other can be really disruptive in an organization. And so to go through that process, it can be very difficult, very challenging. And then to sustain it is a whole other set of challenges that present to the company and people who haven't been through that or haven't sustained a very strong culture before. That is simply unique. You could probably use Bridgewater as a good example of this. You know, Ray Dalio's Principles, I think, is a great book that highlights how you do this very successfully in an in-office environment. They have taken some things, in my opinion, a little bit too far, right? Such as the systems and the processes and how to actually galvanize that system to the max. And, they've done a very successful job at that, right? Being the most successful, one of the most successful investment firms in the world. However, there is an element to that must exist in order for a strong culture to permeate throughout an organization that's completely remote.
Yeah, the other thing that, in the book Principles, and as well as at Toptal, that I've noticed is transparency.
Sure.
You're transparent with those values, and you give people permission to say, hey, it's not where I want to work. And it feels the company's okay with that, and in that permission to say, hey, I want a different work environment. I live in Seattle, and a lot of people, belong at Amazon and don't belong in Amazon. And that it boils down a lot to their values of whether you value the same thing that the company belongs to. Talk to me a little bit about the tools and the software that you find valuable working with your fully distributed team.
Well, we have so many, but probably the main ones are Slack, Zoom, and a tool that we have built called Top Team. And Top Team really glues all of the elements and tools at Toptal together. So you have we have an org chart. We have many different elements that allows someone new to Toptal to organize to navigate the organization through one single system, and then have that all be fed up through all these other different tools that can consume that. And so it's a pretty all-encompassing system. This sounds so basic, but those three tools, those are the three tools that we use every single day and survive on. It's no secret that Slack and Zoom are really the driving forces of remote teams. Of course, we have Gmail and G Suites and other tools that make remote work very successful. But for me as an executive, I will say I could probably live a pretty good life professionally just with Slack, Zoom, and Top Team. And so for me, I'm going to leave it at that.
I was going to say, do you think everybody on your team wishes you were so proficient in Slack?
Well, I'll leave that up to them.
We'll leave it at that. It's amazing to me in the playbook. Let's go back to the playbook of how much information you really share. And I know that's going to be available tomorrow on the Toptal blogs. And so, anybody who's interested in learning really the secret sauce of how Toptal works as the largest fully distributed team. There's interviews with all of the senior leadership team, as well as even screenshots of the internal tools. So it is a pretty comprehensive way to be successful as a distributed company. Emma, if you can go ahead and bring up the question QR code, and I've got one more question for you, Taso. Before one of the things I've seen a lot of business leaders ask is, how should I think about this moment? In this moment, I'm this tough business environment. Do I just let it pass and wait for something to get back to the normal, or how should I think about pivoting or changing or rethinking things? What is your advice to a founder, a small business, or even to a Fortune company that says, hey, in the next 6 months, this is how I would look at it?
Well, I would say prepare to be remote and prepare to have really resilient remote infrastructure. That is now on every CIO's mind. We know that firsthand. We're speaking to a lot of the C-level leaders at Fortune 500 companies. And so definitively, we know that. If we know that, that's information that other people should know and help them prepare for. By helping them prepare, the entire world starts becoming more and more attuned to this idea of working remotely. And that is something that I think we're all really keen on pushing towards as a society, as a global society, making sure that we can all work fluidly remotely. And so if we can make that a reality and we can help other companies make that a reality, then I think that'll be good business for everyone. I think it'll be a better lifestyle for everybody. And it'll actually prove ultimately a safer lifestyle for the world and the companies involved in that.
With the time that you put into the playbook, what is the thing that you hope, if somebody goes to the site tomorrow and is able to get access to it, what is the thing that you hope they walk away with?
So for those not familiar, it's going to be toptal.com/playbook. It releases tomorrow. It's about 80 pages of insight into Toptal. No company, by the way, has ever done something like this, period. Doesn't exist. No company in the world has ever done what we've done, which is give internal insight into how our company runs, soup to nuts, from security to structure to the tools we use to how we have done the integrations. It is a very comprehensive, insightful playbook. So I hope you can all check it out. There's something like 70 contributors who've contributed to it across the organization. We're really excited to release it. Getting back to your question, could you just restate it again? I want to make sure I actually...
The question, and I'm excited for everyone to see it as well with the amount of effort that went into it. But if someone is to go to Toptal/playbook tomorrow and take a look at the work from the team, what is the one thing, if you were sitting next to them while they were reading it, what is the one or two things that you would want them to take away from all of that hard work and insight that the team is providing?
Yeah, so with my sort of build up to what it is, the one thing would be that you can build a multi-thousand person company, run it and sustain it, not just as good as an in-office company backed by Sequoia Capital or Andreessen Horowitz or whoever with hundreds of millions of dollars. You can actually do it with significantly less capital, build a bigger business, and have it run even more effectively than what's happening today. And what remote work allows for is a totally new type of capitalism, a totally new type of business environment, and a totally different type of dynamic that people are just getting attuned to. And so, look, I believe we're going to build a massive company, and I'm very excited about that. A huge reason that I believe we're going to do this is solely because of the fact that we're remote. It's not because we're, the absolute smartest people in the world. There's a lot of smart people. There's a lot of great companies. We actually inherently get a lot of advantages just by being remote. And so if you read that playbook, if you start looking at the insights that we've offered to the world, you'll start seeing some of the advantages that you gain by being in a fully remote environment.
No, it's really, really good insights. And Emma, I'm waiting to see some of the questions. And here's one of the questions. Do you think the office is dead? It's one of the famous questions out of this current environment.
Well, it's certainly not going to be what it was. There are going to be there are going to be far fewer meetings. There are going to be a lot less in-person interactions due to this situation, mostly out of the realization that people now have the permission to do so. I believe we all intuitively and innately understood that we could do this remotely, that we could do a lot of the meetings that we're doing remotely with other constituents external of our organizations. Board meetings, partners, different types of sales that people were making. However, this has really given everyone permission to work remotely. And that is something that we cannot replace. And I think that in effect, and to a fair degree, it will diminish the value that offices have worldwide.
Another question from the chat is, what is the fastest way to get a remote team member to bond to the company?
It's a great question. Well, we actually highlight that in our remote work playbook that we're releasing tomorrow. So you'll get some insight into that.
Toptal/playbook.
Toptal.com/playbook. Exactly. And so one of the things I could just tell you is that we have something called 30 for 30 that we're doing right now. And this is just one specific example. We talk about it in the playbook, where it's a challenge. You have a group of 5 people, and they're competing with other groups of 5 to do 30 minutes of exercise for 30 days straight. And if your team wins, you effectively get a prize and get recognized within the organization. The way that it works is all 5 team members have to consecutively do 30 minutes every single day for them to acquire 1 point, for example. And so at the end of the day, we'll see who has the most amount of points. But the point is that, if 4 people do it and 1 doesn't, all 4 are pushing that one person to be able to get that exercise in so that they can count their points in total towards the score, and everyone's competing in effect. And so there are some fun things like that you can actually catalyze even in a remote work environment. I'd actually say that is more fun in a remote work environment, because that the other person is probably just sitting on their ass, not doing anything. And you're like, hey, you got to get up. You got to do something. Come on, we're going to lose the point today. So there's an element of it that actually makes it a little bit more fun. And so there are things like this that you can do. We also have topical channels based off of cooking, based off of location, language, all these different elements where we can bring people together. And yes, that becomes more meaningful at scale, but actually, and I understand this is an SMB audience for the most part, people working as individuals or at smaller organizations. But the miraculous thing about the situation is actually the larger companies being disrupted in their everyday working environment coming over to this side, which is the remote working side. And so as a byproduct of that, there's a lot of concerns that they have about this exact topic. And there's a lot of solutions that provide to speak to those challenges that are, let's just say, they work very well.
One of the questions that I know is in detail in the playbook is, what is the best way to accurately gauge a candidate? Onboarding, hiring, recruiting, like all of that, when I was working in big tech, I'd get on a plane and go sit there all dressed nicely in a conference room, and, they'd bring you water and go have lunch with someone. That doesn't exist in the remote world. How have you been able to get some of the top talent to work and engage in remote work?
Well, it was difficult at first, and it's still difficult to some degree. I mean, when I say that, I don't mean in today's age, right? Like right now.
Back in the IRC days,
say that maybe, I guess, a month and a half ago, I guess that would be more true. Now it's a little bit easier in the context, so even I'm adjusting to this speak, I suppose. But what makes me say that, right? Because I clearly had a reaction to that was real. Why would I say that? Well, I say that because we're a completely virtual environment, and people haven't stepped into our offices before. They haven't experienced Toptal in a real world situation or seen a picture of where we work or our address, etc. And so it's still a little bit perplexing for people to understand the idea of a fully distributed, fully remote company that exists without an office, without an environment at all, right? A physical environment at all. And so it's still a little bit challenging to convince really great talent to come on board in different respective areas. We do finance, we do product management and project management. There are still today, even after this situation, I believe, going to be project managers who say, you have to be in an office. It's still important. This whole remote working thing has just been so disruptive because I can't manage the people in person. I want to do my daily stand-ups as actual stand-ups. With that said, it is going to become easier because of the situation, but it's the realness element that makes it difficult to recruit people. And actually, to the playbook, we talk about how to make it more real and how to actually build public trust and credibility as a remote organization so that people can experience the trust that they experience when walking into the offices of Google or Facebook or credible organizations all over the world. Replicating that in a remote work environment is critical, and it's possible to do.
I'm imagining you've had a lot of people talk about 5 years ago that would question, is Toptal real? because you don't have an office that there's a picture of. Is it a real thing? And here you've built a pretty large company. One of the questions in the chat is, how many remote employees, or I guess it'd be how many employees does Toptal have?
Well, we're not exactly precise with the number, but I can say that our total distributed workforce, which includes our employees, our core team members, our active workforce deployed at clients today, is over 4,000. So we are by far the largest fully distributed workforce in the world, and growing at a pretty fast rate, over 40% year over year. So that gives you some insight into our scale.
What was the darkest hours of Toptal when you were growing like crazy? Just kind of growing things and scaling pains.
Well, there were a lot of dark hours, and they relate to primarily business challenges. I'm not sure that remote and the challenges pertaining to remote were so on my mind during those days, because it was really just about acquiring new business and figuring out how to grow the company. So while remote was a challenge, and frankly still remains a challenge to some degree, lesser but still a challenge, the business challenges at the time were really specific to and no different to growing a company that's a startup company. So it gives you some insight that actually the challenges in a remote company are not so different than that of a typical in-office company.
And we have time for one more question, I believe. What is the hardest part of maintaining the culture as your team grows in size and in geography across the various geographies? Maintaining that consistency.
That's a great question, and that's one of the most difficult things to do within a remote organization. The primary way that Toptal institutionalizes its culture and sustains it is by talking about values, by exemplifying the values continuously, by, not to sound too draconian, rewarding and punishing when elements are aligned or not aligned with our values. And we're very explicit about that, right? One of, if you haven't picked up on it already, two of our values are being direct and transparent. And so we're not afraid to say, hey, we reward and we punish people, right? People say, well, wait, that sounds almost draconian, or that's too harsh to say punish. Well, hey, look, that's our culture, right? You don't like it, don't work here. Right? There are people who actually are drawn to that, where they're saying, hey, this is exactly what I was looking for. I was looking to not be beating around the bush all the time and speaking directly about the problems. Not only is Toptal saying that, because a lot of people are saying that, but they're living it. And they live it in every sense. Another great example is, and another thing that's controversial, is the fact that we don't do any of our surveys anonymously. Right? So we don't do our pulse surveys, which are the surveys that talk to how is the company ENPS score, employee net promoter score, how is each person's individual happiness score at the company. Now, a very valid argument is, well, since the person's not anonymous, they're not going to give you the truth. Well, okay, understood. That's fair. However, I will say that I'd rather not have that person give me the truth than be false within our cultural values and say, oh no, you can be anonymous, yet at the same time saying that we believe in transparency. I mean, that's a complete contradiction. And so I would rather be the person who has integrity and authenticity and our values representing the company, rather than worrying about if people are going to be truthful to us. If we are authentic and have a high degree of integrity, I believe that as a byproduct of that, people will be truthful to you, and you'll be able to, let's say, facilitate that feedback loop effectively. So, those are some controversial opinions, but from our perspective, it's worked out pretty well.
And it's always set up front. You know, if you like we're talking about at the beginning of this conversation, those values and that ethos is set up front if you want to join the organization. And again, toptal.com/playbook. You know, if you don't believe that Taso and the team are releasing something that is showing you the inside of how to create the world's largest distributed company, I encourage you to check out the website tomorrow, because it goes everywhere from the high level executive strategies that you may need all the way down to the, you know, to the nitty gritty detail
Right.
of running one of the largest distributed companies. Taso, thank you as always. Enjoyed the conversation. And thank you to the people over at Remote Aid, Igor and team, for allowing us to have this opportunity.